Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. It's my privilege to introduce Ben Taub. Many of you will recognize Ben from his byline in the New Yorker or from his appearance on Team CILO in The Voice. In 2013, Ben traveled to Kilis, which is a town on the Turkish-Syrian border. On the border, he met a Belgian man whose son had gone and radicalized in Europe and then traveled to join ISIS in Syria. Ben wrote about this man's son's journey to jihad and about the European jihadi pipeline for his thesis problem at the Columbia School of Journalism, which was then published last summer as a cover story in the New Yorker. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, I highly recommend it. It's really a tremendous piece of journalism. And over the past year, Ben's continued writing for the New Yorker. He went to Brussels after the attacks in March, and his most recent long-form story was on the doctors of the Syrian civil war, and it's incredibly moving. Also, highly recommend it. Tonight, Ben's going to talk with us about his piece for the New Yorker, which was supported by the Pulitzer Center, which focuses on the over 600,000 documents that activists have struggled out of Syria, and the people who want to use these documents to make a powerful war crimes case against the Assad regime. We'll start out tonight with Ben, who's going to give us a brief overview, and then he's going to have a discussion with our senior editor, Tom Hundley, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. And if you're interested in learning about more projects that we support here at the Pulitzer Center, you should sign up for our newsletter outside. And if you want to share this, what I'm sure is going to be a really exciting talk, it's going to be live streamed on YouTube, and you can go to our YouTube channel and share it afterwards. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Ben, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Ben. That was an incredibly kind introduction, except for the part about the voice, which I've been gradually trying to hope would disappear. So I'm here to speak with you today about the Syrian war, which is very complicated and messy, and so I'm going to focus on a very specific part of that, which is the pursuit of justice, specifically in the perpetration of war crimes. This is a war that in some ways, these crimes are not at all unprecedented. They happen in many conflicts. They are prosecuted in the aftermath of many conflicts, and yet Syria is a place and a battlefield that is so politically messy that it's sort of a vacuum of accountability. The International Criminal Court has no authority to investigate crimes committed by any sides of the conflict. Syrian government, ISIS, rebels, Jabhat al-Nusra. There is no authority for investigation or prosecution at this time. And so what we see now is the only jurisdiction in which people actually can be prosecuted, if there's sufficient evidence, is in local European jurisdictions. If a perpetrator shows up in the refugee stream and happens to be found, and there's sufficient evidence to prosecute them, then that can go forward on a domestic case. But this is a conflict in which, owing to this sort of lack of the political will, frankly, at the UN Security Council to pursue accountability, Russia and China blocked a resolution to give the ICC the jurisdiction a couple of years ago. The Syrian battlefield has become one in which war crimes are practiced not only in a widespread and systematic manner, but as a strategy of the conflict. You see this often in the news. Starvation, sieges, that's starving a civilian population is a war crime. Indiscriminate shelling, done both by the rebels and by the Syrian government. Shelling indiscriminately in a crowded civilian urban area is a war crime. The use of barrel bombs, which are indiscriminate weapons that kill large numbers of people, blow up entire city blocks, and often kill not just the people who are wounded by the shrapnel and the fire, but also everyone in the vicinity, because the air fills with concrete, and so people inhale concrete and their lungs fill with concrete and they suffocate. That's another war crime. But this sort of origin of the war crimes in Syria began from the earliest days with the strategy of repression practiced in response to the earliest protests, which is what this story focuses on today, and that's This is the first ever war crimes case that has been investigated by an independent agency to a standard that can be prosecuted in an international tribunal using documents that were smuggled out in the midst of very, very active conflict. So I'll begin with, I guess it begins 4 years ago. In early 2012, a group of war crimes investigators who had worked at many international criminal tribunals in the past, at Yugoslavia Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, investigators and prosecutors, they got together and essentially decided that they would start their own organization called the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, and this group would investigate, would sort of train. They were asked by the head of the group, his name is Bill Wiley, he was asked by the British government if he would train Syrian activists to document atrocities and film airstrikes and the kinds of things that we see. This is a war in which you can watch pretty much all of it on YouTube. And he said, that sounds kind of useless because filming an airstrike on a hospital doesn't actually help prosecute whoever's responsible for ordering that airstrike. What matters here is not necessarily the crime itself. What matters in terms of the pursuit of justice is being able to pin that crime on an actual actor who came up with the plan for this practice of conflict, this conduct of hostilities, and was in charge of the chain of command that then carried it out. And so he suggested instead training these activists and lawyers that the British government had sort of identified, and training them instead to collect the kinds of evidence that would actually serve in a trial. So Bill held his first training session in Istanbul. They had a few dozen Syrian activists and journalists and lawyers come together, and he taught them how to do sort of witness interviews that would be credible in court, how to collect valid evidence and measure like artillery craters, so you can measure where they were fired from and whether that was a particular strategy for the war to target a civilian area. But most importantly, he wanted them to collect documents, regime documents that were captured from security and intelligence facilities as the Syrian government retreated and rebels made gains. So this sort of coincided with some significant gains on the part of the rebels in 2012 in particular. And as the rebels took over large swaths of territory in northern Syria, southern Syria, and eastern Syria primarily, this group had people on the ground who were well connected to rebel commanders, and those rebel commanders knew that when they took over a security intelligence facility for military intelligence or Air Force intelligence, they should call up one of these investigators who would then go in, collect all the documents, box them up, take everything they could, because if they left anything behind, then they could be accused of, or if they rifled through the evidence, they could be accused by a defense lawyer of, ignoring exculpatory evidence and leaving it behind. So they had to take everything, put them in boxes, wrap them up, and then because it was so difficult to get them out of the country, often they would bury them in the ground or in safe houses or in farmhouses until they found a way to extract them across international borders. So eventually, this group, which formed properly and became an NGO registered in Western Europe. Well, I can say where they're registered. They're registered in the Netherlands, because that's public information, but I can't say where they're based, because they have a lot of security concerns. But they started funneling these documents back to Western Europe through international borders, through very perilous extractions. You'd have situations in which someone would have to smuggle. How do you smuggle? Because it's physical copies. You can't take photos and send the photos of the documents back for court. You need the originals with the signatures, with the stamps, all the stuff that you have a clear chain of custody from the point that it was picked up to the point that it ended up in the storage facility in Western Europe to the point that it ends up before a judge, however many years from now that may be. And so, how do you smuggle 100,000 documents out of Syria? They devised these pretty elaborate plans. You would have an investigator who would spend every single day for a couple of months going through every checkpoint between where the documents were hidden in a cave or something and whatever border that he planned to get out of. He would drive that route every day, sometimes multiple times, get to know every checkpoint, get to know the guys at every checkpoint, always in an empty van, always without cargo. And so they would get used to him. They would get used to seeing his face. Sometimes he'd give them snacks. He would always thank them for protecting the local civilians. And so he became invisible. And so this driver then, one day, loads up the van with 100,000 documents in one particular extraction that I describe in the piece. 100,000 documents, puts them in the car, goes to the checkpoints. He's got a couple of vehicles that go ahead of him, who then could, radio back to him saying, yeah, it's the same guys at each checkpoint, nothing's changed. And he just sped right through as if he were invisible. And then he got to the international border, which then the European office has a difficult time negotiating with bordering countries to open what are otherwise sealed borders in order to get these documents out and then through diplomatic channels get them back to Western Europe with that clear chain of custody. So they did this, and when I went to visit the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, by the time I got there, they had already completed their first case. They had smuggled more than 600,000 documents out of the country. They had a team of lawyers and translators pour through them, sort out what's important, what is useless. And important doesn't just mean incriminating. Important means anything that's related to the criminality that they're focusing on. So that includes exculpatory evidence, things that could be presented in court to suggest an alternate story. Anything that's related, they have to collect and translate. And they translated it to a legally viable standard. So by the time I got there, they had a legal brief, 400-page legal brief, that summarized all the evidence, that had 1,600 footnotes for each document, each witness testimony, and kind of all the work that they had done had been done for a case for crimes against humanity in detention facilities. So I spent a couple of months working with them, working with the documents, and understanding how sort of a criminal case would work, and how, in particular, this criminal case would work. And they were able to trace the systematic torture and murder of tens of thousands of people to a policy that was devised by Bashar al-Assad, the president's highest level security committee, that was approved by Assad himself, and then that was implemented via multiple parallel chains of command within the military and the intelligence services on the ground, and this international criminal law takes into account the fact that the highest level perpetrators are rarely present at the scene of the crime, and so there's a mode of liability called command control responsibility. If you can trace that orders that were devised at the top then resulted in mass atrocities systematically in a widespread manner, and that those at the top knew it was happening, they don't ever have to have said, torture these people. They just have to have said, it made orders that resulted in that torture, that then they were aware that the torture was happening as a result of their orders in the pursuit of the objectives that they had outlined. And so this is what happened. On March 27th, 2011, a couple of weeks into the earliest protests in Syria, President Assad gathered some of his closest confidants the heads of the 4 security intelligence agencies, military leaders, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Interior, his brother, Maher al-Assad, and a couple of other peripheral characters. And he organized what he called the Central Crisis Management Cell. And this was a body that was tasked with devising the crackdown in order to prevent a real uprising. And they then, I guess if we fast forward a bit, I mean, there was a policy very early on. There were a lot of people that were detained. There were people that were shot at the earliest protests. There were also instances very quickly. I mean, it was the insurrection. There were instances in which armed people were attending protests and firing back earlier than is often said. The earliest instances that I see in the Security Committee meeting minutes that were smuggled out, you see things in April 2011 where already the security services are from time to time in certain provinces dealing with armed groups. But the crackdown overall was security forces detaining people that they suspected might be involved in organizing and planning these protests or attending them, and often killing them either in detention or by shooting at protesters. But in those early months, the effort was really more focused. There was a lot of effort to try to do it without inflaming the situation. There were, of course, instances where a lot of people were killed, and that did inflame the situation, but you see in the meeting minutes that they're in the Security Committee meetings, they're trying to find a way to end this without killing people. Like that wasn't the goal. And things continued to spiral out of control. And on August 5th, by which point there was a group that called itself the Free Syrian Army, largely made up of defected officers from the military who said that they couldn't stand beside the security forces as they massacred protesters, formed their own armed groups. On August 5th, the crisis cell met, and Assad didn't attend these meetings, by the way. Assad stayed in the presidential palace, and every night the members of the crisis cell would meet. They would discuss every security issue in every province that was of issue. There was actually, the way that we know this, there was a young man named Abdelmajid Barakat. They kind of made a mistake. So early on they hired a young guy named Abdelmajid Barakat. He was 24 years old. His job was to process all the security reports coming from all over the country. So all the low-level and mid-level security apparatus officers would send reports of what's happening in their neighborhoods up to their provincial leaders, and then the provincial leaders would send those to Damascus and the center. And so Abdelmajid Barakat had to read all the reports coming from all the provinces, then draft a summary and give this summary to the crisis cell, which they would use to guide their meetings. Barakat, very early on, already planned to defect. He was a mole from the beginning. And eventually he did defect, and he smuggled out with him about 1,500 pages of crisis cell meeting minutes, which he handed to the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. By the way, Bill Wiley is the one with the hair. He founded the group. Chris Engels is the head of the Regime Crimes Unit. He's the lawyer who largely oversaw the crafting of this case. And this is in their evidence room where they have the 600,000 pages. So after Barakat handed the summary, they would have these meetings based on the security issues that he described in each province. They would devise a list of sort of methods to crack down and how to fix them. And then they would send them via courier to Assad, who would review them, who would sometimes edit them, cross things out, make additions, and then sign them and send them back to the crisis cell for implementation. And because the crisis cell is made up of the head of the military, Minister of Defense, the head of the Ministry of Interior, which is in charge of the police, and the 4 security agencies, each of those guys would then be responsible for sending those orders, which have now been approved by the president and are now actual orders not just suggestions, down their chains of command to every province, and then from every province to every district, and then from every district to every sub-district. So everything was on a real granular level. There was a moment, I remember being astounded when I was going through one of the letters from one member of the crisis cell to another. And he's concerned about a piece of, a graffiti mark on a water pipe in Deir ez-Zor province, more than 350 miles from Damascus, in which someone had written, "Down with Bashar." And he said he sends back orders down the chain to those agents in Deir ez-Zor province saying, find the perpetrator, because they sent it back up to him. And they spent a month looking, and then they send him back another note that says, we tried, we couldn't find him, like, very sorry. But that's how much of a grasp they had on what was happening in every province on an extremely granular level, and it's because of this chain of command, which the CIJA rebuilt with the actual documents. You have signatures, signed documents that are, show up in Barakat's smuggled meeting minutes, which then you see echoed in Deir ez-Zor province security committee meetings, where they're discussing the policies of the crisis cell, in letters from security agents from one branch to another, in which they actually append the crisis cell's instructions saying, this is what we got from Damascus, like, implement this now. So the policy that was drafted on August 5th, 2011 forms the center of the case, and that's because of its contents. This was where it became what the CIJA alleges is a joint criminal, or it's a criminal enterprise and a policy to detain anybody who was opposed to the government. And I'll give you a summary. I think I can even quote some of the documents. He says, in 5 months of revolution, the protests had spread to several more provinces, which the members of the committee had attributed to the laxness in handling the crisis, according to these documents. They blamed weak coordination and cooperation among security bodies, and that evening they devised a plan to target specific categories of people. So this targeting of specific categories, who then show up in being detained and tortured, like this is sort of how the case works. First, all security branches were to launch daily raids against protest organizers and those who tarnish the image of Syria in foreign media. Direct quote. Next, another quote, once each sector has been cleansed of wanted people, security agents would coordinate with Ba'athist loyalist neighborhood militias and community leaders to ensure that opposition activists could not return to those areas. They literally said, we have to make this unlivable for the opposition. Third, they would, quote, establish a joint investigation committee at the province level made up of representatives from all the security branches who would interrogate the detainees. And then the results, and this is key in terms of criminal culpability of the guys at the top, the results would be, shall be sent to all security branches so they can be used in the identification of new targets that need to be prosecuted. And this policy became the linchpin of the CIJA's case. It was sent down the chain of command. They can trace it going down, and they can trace the results of those interrogations being sent back up. So what happened during those interrogations? People were targeted according to this policy. They were arrested, they were detained, they were brought to security branches. Assad had approved of a new law that expanded the amount of time that people could be held without a trial. But still, it may have violated some international human rights standards. I believe you could be held for a maximum of 90 days without seeing a judge. But it's not. That itself would not be sort of a crime against humanity. The security agents needed to get results, and so you had in these cells. First of all, people were kept in unbelievably horrific detention conditions. Detainees were dying all the time of diseases they picked up in detention. Their legs were covered in scabies. They would get beaten routinely, and the wounds would get infected. They would be packed in a room like this. Actually, there would be something like 200 people for months. There was one of the I saw repeatedly, there was the CIJA interviewed hundreds of detainees who had survived, who described the same conditions. They all converged on the same patterns in detention centers all over the country. The detainee that I interviewed stayed at a detention center that many of their witnesses interviewed as well. I'll move to his photograph because now I'm focusing on the crimes itself. This is Mazen al-Hamada. He's the man that I focus on for the second half of the piece. He was an activist in Deir ez-Zor province who never participated in any violence, did organize protests. He was calling for the downfall of the regime, and he was picked up first in Deir ez-Zor province and then released and then under an amnesty. There were some efforts to try to quell things by occasionally giving amnesties for really non-violent offenders, but then he was picked up again in Damascus when he moved there, and he was trying to smuggle baby milk into the besieged neighborhood of Daraya, which today has now been besieged for 4 years, and got its first shipment of food a few weeks ago, and then after the food was dropped off by the aid trucks and before anyone could pick it up, there would just rain down barrel bombs on the delivery site. At any rate, Mazen was held in a solitary confinement cell with 10 other people. And that was something that I saw in a lot of witness testimonies. Solitary confinement cell, anywhere from 6 to 13 people, for months. So the conditions are horrible, but then the key part in terms of the criminality was these interrogations in accordance with the policy. How do you justify that you've detained these people? You have to find what crime they did. So, and this is really a representative example that you see tens of thousands of people have undergone this. In fact, tens of thousands have died. I don't know if the correct number might be hundreds of thousands have undergone the detention. Today, I believe there was a report, a Monitor report that came out a few months ago that said 60,000 have died in detention, so who knows how many have been detained. At any rate, the interrogation was the key step. Mazen, like everybody else, was blindfolded, dragged into the interrogation room. They handcuffed his hands to the ceiling and left him there for a few hours with his feet off the ground. Sometimes, in other cases, other witnesses described their hands being handcuffed behind their backs before they were lifted up and dangled from their arms. When it came time to ask him the questions, they asked him questions specifically related to the crisis cell's instructions, which I don't want to misstate what's here, but these were they were very specific questions about organizing protests, like who are the other protest organizers, who's funding these protests, who is coordinating what with whom, did you supply videos to foreign media, all this. And he said yes. Eventually, after being tortured a bit, he said, yeah, I organized protests, I sent videos to Al Jazeera, I filmed the Crackdown, and I did that stuff. And they said, okay, but who did you kill from the military? And he said he didn't. By this point, they burned cigarettes out on his legs. I saw the scars. They had, I think that's as far as it had gone at this point. So then, I want to read you some of his quotes because it's really shocking. They asked him how many people he killed from the Syrian government, and he hadn't done this. So he told me, the challenge here is how do you make up a story that you killed all these people? His hands at this point were cuffed to the pipe, and his feet were off the ground, and he had all the weight on his wrists. And they were beating him. They broke 4 of his ribs. And eventually, they wanted him to confess to these terrorism charges, which he hadn't participated in any acts of terrorism. And so they beat him and tortured him further and further. I don't want to continue describing the torture, but it got extremely, extremely graphic, and you can read about it in the article if you want. Although I think I even left out some of it because it was too much. Until they got a confession. That's what they needed. They needed him to confess to having done a crime. So then, a few months later, he was put back in his cell. A few months later, he and his nephews who were detained with him were brought to another room where detainees were forced to thumbprint the write-ups of their confessions. He was blindfolded. It was often the case that people were blindfolded. Actually, no, he wasn't blindfolded. It was often the case that people were blindfolded. He just told me that he didn't have a chance to read it because he was just forced to thumbprint and move on. And he witnessed a murder while they were in line to thumbprint their confessions. And this was key for the Syrian government because once you have this confession, you have it thumbprinted, saying, yes, I did these crimes. I confess to having killed however many people you made me kill. He was negotiating, if I recall, he was negotiating with his torturers over the degree of the crimes because they wanted him to confess not only to killing people but also to carrying a gun. And he's eventually, after being tortured, he was like, I carried a hunting rifle. And they said, no, that's not good enough because they wanted to accuse him of terrorism. So they said, like, it was a Kalashnikov. He said, no, I carried a hunting rifle. So they beat him and they beat him and they beat him until he said he carried a Kalashnikov, and the torturer said, I need 2 magazines, and it escalated further and further and further until he confessed everything. So once you have this confession, then the next step of the process for the detainees who live long enough to get there is their cases might be referred to the judiciary. And in court, the evidence against them is submitted as their confession, signed, thumbprinted, saying they committed all these crimes, and then that's when the legal detention begins. Because then, if the judge rules against them, they can be sent to prison for having committed crimes. So all this stuff that we've been describing is all extrajudicial. It's before entering the judicial system. And so this system of coerced confessions created a veneer of judicial process by getting confessions that then could be supplied to courts for prosecutions. Mazen got very lucky. He met a judge he was presented before a judge who was sympathetic to him, who, when he showed his cigarette burns, his broken ribs, his emaciated body,